More than 30 Christians were recently arrested in the northeastern African nation of Eritrea for praying. The government there outlawed all Pentecostal churches 17 years ago. The prayer arrest is just one of many examples of Christian persecution now taking place around the world. FaithWire reports that the Gatestone Institute says the persecution of Christians by extremist groups and individuals is on the rise. And Aid to the Church in Need warned that around 300 million Christians worldwide have suffered violence, making Christianity the most persecuted religion in the world. Our CBN News senior international correspondent Gary Lane, he's traveled the world covering Christian persecution. Welcome, Gary.
Glad to be here, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for talking about this important topic.
Yes.
How much worse has the persecution of Christians gotten over the last several years?
You know, I don't know about that 300 million figure. It's tough to come up with figures like that. Generally, the accepted number has been like 200,000, 250,000. But Open Doors USA reported in their 2019 report that 11 Christians are killed every day. And I think that's fairly accurate. Let's look at some of the worst places. I'd say it's getting worse now because of groups like ISIS. Also Boko Haram in Nigeria. In Somalia, you have another group there, Al-Shabaab. And because of the rise of these groups, these militant Islamic groups, we're seeing Christians persecuted, Christians killed, their churches burned. Of course, in Iraq and Syria, let's take a look at Iraq, for example. Before the war there, we had maybe 1.5 million Christians. Now, Mark, they're down to maybe only about 250,000. And that's because many were killed, many were kidnapped, chased out of the country. Also in Syria, much of the same thing.
Is this persecution worse in Muslim countries, or is it equally bad elsewhere?
Yeah, I would say it's worse in Muslim countries, but also in other places. The worst places, of course, Afghanistan, also Somalia. But this is Pakistan. A family just recently, last month, were chased from their home on false charges of blasphemy. A crowd came and said, "You're blasphemers," all over a dispute on a telephone call. And that happened to them. Christians were chased from the area. About 5 years ago, this couple, they were murdered in a brick kiln. They're brick kiln workers. And the woman was raped, and then both of them were killed in front of their children. Also China, though, Mark. China's one of the worst right now to be a Christian. Churches are being destroyed. If they're not destroyed, the Chinese government is shutting them down. One of the most recent ones occurred last December with the Early Rain Covenant Church. 100 people were arrested. The pastor was taken into custody. He's still in prison, charged with subverting the state, subversion against the state. Many of them were also tortured and beaten. That's what's happening in China today. The Christians there say it's the worst that they've seen since the Cultural Revolution under Mao. So tough times for Christians in Muslim countries, also in China, India as well, Hindu.
Let's go to Europe now.
Yes.
What about in Europe and then in other places? Like you talked a little bit about Africa, but let's talk more about Africa.
Well, I would say Nigeria is one of the worst places right now to be a Christian because of groups like Al-Shabaab. And Christians have been killed throughout the central part of the country, also those that are residing in the northern part. Militant Muslims known as the Fulani, they're herdsmen, they just come into villages and wipe Christians out. They have AK-47s and they're armed and they come in and because they want the land. So they'll just wipe the Christians out of their villages. In addition to that, as I had mentioned, Boko Haram, that's a militant terrorist group that's operating in the northeastern part of Nigeria, and they kidnapped Leah Sharibu. She was 15. I think she's 16 now, but she wasn't released, Mark, because she stood firm in her faith and said, look, I'm a Christian, I'm not going to convert to Islam. Other girls that were kidnapped were released because they either converted or they were Muslim, but because she stood firm in her Christian faith, she's now a sex slave to Boko Haram affiliated militants.
And then in Europe, persecution there too of Christians?
Well, I would say what's happening against Christians in Europe is more discrimination, but certainly Christians that have come there who have fled the Middle East and are refugees, the UN and the refugee centers are putting them in with Muslims, and they're persecuted by Muslims. I met a pastor years ago in Syria who went to Norway and ended up being a refugee there, and he was persecuted by Muslims there.
Wow.
He was chased out of the country. He's in another country now.
Wow, our senior international correspondent, Gary Lane, thank you so much for your information.
Sure.
We really need to hear about this.
Sure.